December 1st, 2023. The Texas nationalist movement claims to have collected enough signatures on a petition to force a vote within the GOP on the question of whether Texas should secede from the U.S. They are one step closer to making their dream a reality, for Texas to become an independent nation. But would it even be legal for Texas to secede? Would the U.S. allow it to happen? And could Texas survive as an independent nation? These are the questions we'll aim to answer in today's video. So first off, would the U.S. even allow Texas to secede? For the answer, we can look to the aftermath of the American Civil War. Texas fought on the side of the Confederacy, which means it lost that war. And following the Confederacy's defeat in 1865, it took 5 years for Texas to be welcomed back as an official member of the United States. Some believe the concept of secession was settled following the Union's victory in the Civil War. The Union's victory meant that states could not ever legally secede. However, even without that assumption, the lack of a right to secede was solidified in 1869 during the case of Texas v. White. The case held that no state could unilaterally secede from the Union, even if the majority of people in that state were in full support of secession. Such actions would be absolutely null, with Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase writing that Texas entered an indissoluble relation with the United States when it chose to rejoin the Union. Seems like a settled issue then, right? Well, not so fast. There is language in earlier documents that secessionists may lean on to give themselves legal precedent. For instance, the language used in America's 1845 annexation of Texas is a common source of confusion. That document says that Texas can choose to divide itself into, quote, new states of convenient size not exceeding 4 in number, in addition to said state of Texas. Some secessionists say that translates to Texas being in control of the future of the state, though nowhere in the annexation documentation does the U.S. say Texas has the right to secede, only that it can split. And since there is no right to secede written into U.S. law, the conversation over secession can only ever end one way from a legal standpoint. So then, how does Texas secede? Well, with a fight. With the limited legal avenues exhausted, Texas would be forced to go to war for its independence. It's done so before, to the point where you could argue that fighting for independence is baked into the state's culture. However, its results have been mixed. It managed to defeat Mexico and become a sovereign state in 1836, though it was also part of the Confederacy that lost the American Civil War. Would Texas have a better chance of winning a fight for secession today? If Texas declared it was seceding and was willing to fight for that fact, it would find itself up against the rest of the United States of America, also known as the world's strongest army. The U.S. military has 1.328 million active personnel, with nearly 800,000 more in reserve, as well as over 13,200 aircraft and a powerful navy containing 472 assets. It's an overwhelming force that would quickly surround Texas on almost all sides, barring the southern border. Texas would also likely find little help from its southern neighbors in Mexico, even ignoring the historical relationship between the two. Initiatives like Operation Lone Star have raised tensions between Texas and Mexico. Add to the fact that Mexico would have no interest in fighting the U.S. on Texas's behalf, a stance which likely goes for every other country on the planet, and Texas would be in for a tough fight militarily. Granted, those in favor of secession might argue that Texas is home to 15 military bases and over 112,500 military personnel as of 2022, but that's barely relevant. Troops stationed in Texas don't automatically become Texas's to use if the state ever finds itself at war. All of those bases and soldiers are controlled by the U.S. military, with many of the soldiers not even coming from Texas, and they would be withdrawn or used to fight Texas on its own turf. However, Texas does have its own military presence, one that's wholly controlled by the state. It's called the Texas Military Force, or TMF. With a budget of $1.851 billion in 2022 and 23, the TMF is a state military that includes the Texas Army National Guard, Texas Air National Guard, and the Texas State Guard of the Texas Militia. The problem is that the TMF is tiny in comparison to the U.S. military, as its just over 113,000 members are dwarfed by the more than 1.3 million active U.S. service members. There's simply no way that the TMF could put up much of a resistance against the U.S. outside of a guerrilla war within the state. That would likely lead to all major secessionist figures being killed or captured. Still, let's assume that Texas somehow makes it, whether by finding a legal loophole or by standing its ground long enough for the U.S. to stop caring about keeping the state. Texas secedes and becomes a sovereign nation. What happens then? How would Texas fare as its own country? On the surface, things actually look fairly good for the Lone Star State. The Office of the Governor of Texas says that the state has a $2.4 trillion economy, which would make it the 8th largest economy in the world as a standalone country. The Texas office claims this would even place it above major world powers such as Russia and China in terms of economic prosperity, with the state also being responsible for producing 9% of America's gross domestic product. The state is home to 52 of the Fortune 500 companies and also accounts for 22% of America's exports. These types of stats are often highlighted by secessionists, who use them to claim that Texas could easily succeed on its own thanks to its strong economy. However, the stats also hide some serious problems within that economy. For instance, the distribution of the state's wealth is increasingly uneven. 90% of Texans born in the 1940s earned more than their parents, which is a number that fell substantially for Texans born in the 1980s, where only 50% outperformed their parents. Income mobility is a problem, and one that the current leadership is unlikely to want to solve. After all, Texas is home to 66 billionaires who together earn more than 70% of Texans combined. Poverty is also a problem. In 2021, the state ranked 10th out of all 50 American states for poverty, with its 14.2% rate surpassing the national average of 1.4% by a staggering 12.8%. These are economic problems that a new regime would have to confront quickly to temper any sentiment towards Texas rejoining the U.S. after secession. We also can't ignore the fact that Texas receives a lot of federal funding. 2021 saw the U.S. government dole out $1.3 trillion to state and local governments, with Texas ranking third among recipients by taking a $105.8 billion slice of that pie. Only California at $162.9 billion and New York at $110.2 billion received more. That money disappears the moment Texas secedes, which would be a major blow to its economy. But there's something that matters even more than money: food. In 2017, the University of Texas at Austin conducted a study that found that Texas's agricultural industry produces 8.65 trillion calories per year. While that sounds like a lot on paper, the study also pointed out that the average person requires 769,790 calories annually. Divide that 8.65 trillion by that number and you get enough food to feed 11.236 million people. Nowhere near enough for the 30.5 million people who live in Texas. Agriculturally speaking, Texas as a sovereign nation would be incapable of sustaining itself, meaning it would have to rely on importing food from its neighbors to feed its population. Those imports would come at a massive cost, especially if the U.S. decides not to supply food to Texas or to ramp up prices so that the state really feels the food pinch as punishment for its secession. Still, at least the new country's energy sector would be strong. The U.S. Energy Information Administration notes that Texas is America's leading producer of natural gas and crude oil. In 2023, it accounted for 27% of the nation's natural gas withdrawals, along with 43% of its crude oil. That means it should have enough to maintain its population from an energy perspective, but even those production levels come with problems. What's to say that the U.S. couldn't make it difficult for Texas to export its oil and gas should the state secede? It could certainly choose not to buy Texan oil and gas, and as we've seen during the Ukraine war, the U.S. could even levy sanctions against Texan exports to hurt the state economically. Even the country's lucrative tourism sector would likely take a hit. That sector employs 1.3 million Texans and is a $193.8 billion industry. Much of that industry is fueled by domestic visitors. As Travel Texas noted in 2023, Texas welcomed 115.8 million overnight visitors from within the U.S., with 49.4 million of those people coming from out of state. Why does that matter? Texas becoming a sovereign nation means that those out-of-state visitors would have to get visas to enter the state. It's a small issue, but it might give pause to the 40% of people who traveled to Texas for a vacation in 2023. The convenience factor disappears. It's likely that the state's tourism industry, like so many of its other industries, would suffer a big blow due to Texas no longer being part of the U.S. Another thing worth noting is Texas's population. As massive as the state may be, it is the second largest state by area with nearly 262,000 square miles of land and over 7,300 square miles of water. Its population of 30.5 million would be fairly low compared to other nations and would rank 51st for population, directly behind the Ivory Coast with 31.934 million people. In other words, the new country of Texas wouldn't be especially large, from a population perspective at least. That would have a knock-on effect on its no longer federally funded economy, as well as causing problems militaristically. 30.5 million people isn't a lot to draw from when you need to build a military capable of defending against the US and Mexico. It's clear that a Texas secession would come with a slew of its own issues. But do everyday Texans even want to secede? Even with all of the problems we've highlighted, you might be surprised by the answer. Remember that the Texas nationalist movement claims their petition managed to attract 140,000 voter signatures. For context, Texas has a population of about 30.5 million people, with the petition accounting for less than 0.5% of that number. Not a great start in terms of support, with the situation made worse for the TNM as the GOP refused to raise the secession question in its primary ballot despite the signatures collected. However, there are surveys that suggest the desire for secession is stronger than it appears. For instance, YouGov conducted a survey of 35,000 Americans in February of 2024, which found that 23% of Americans support their state seceding from the U.S. Digging deeper into the YouGov numbers, we see that Texas comes second among states in which secession is popular, with 31% of Texans polled by the organization saying they supported the movement. Only Alaska scored higher, with 36%. A similar survey conducted by Redfield and Wilton Strategies, also in February of 2024, revealed similar results. The survey found that, quote, 67% of likely voters would vote to remain within the United States if presented with a secession referendum. That places support for secession at 33%, which aligns well with the YouGov figure. This second survey also asked Texans if they believe the state has the right to secede, with 45% saying it does. A similar number, 44%, either agree or strongly agree that Texas would be a successful sovereign nation if it did secede. Interestingly, the YouGov poll contained a similar question in which it quizzed its respondents on whether they think their state has the right to secede. About a quarter, 26%, said yes, with 35% saying no and 39% answering that they weren't sure. So, is secession actually a good idea for Texas? The simple answer is no. Legally speaking, it's not even possible, meaning Texas would have to fight for secession against a far more powerful nation. Economically, secession is also a bad move. Despite Texas having such a strong economy, it has that economy in the context of being part of the U.S. Secession would lead to serious problems with feeding the state's population and the prospect of attempting to trade with a hostile U.S. and its allies. Not an ideal scenario for maximizing economic output. Add to all of this that the growing Texas secession movement is still far from large enough to account for all Texans. Over 2/3 don't want to secede, and the newly formed nation would face internal strife, even if Texas managed to gain independence. With all of this, it seems that Texas needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Texas. That alone is enough reason for the secession movement to fail. But what do you think? Could Texas make secession work, or is the push toward it little more than a showcasing of the frustration some within the state have with the federal government? Share your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching, and take care out there.